Buckle up, folks, because today we're going to take a deep dive into a military situation that has gone from a bold power play to a potential disaster.
Yeah, a stark reminder that even the best laid plans can go astray, especially on the modern battlefield.
So set the scene for us. What were we looking at initially?
We were watching forces advance into the Kursk region, a move with huge historical weight. This marked the first time since World War II that an outside military force had set foot in this particular territory. A bold move, initially hailed by some as a stroke of genius.
A big move, lots of historical baggage. But every maneuver has a purpose, right? What were the goals behind this offensive?
Absolutely. There were three primary objectives driving this whole operation. First, push as far into Kursk as possible with the aim of seizing a vital asset, a power plant.
Makes sense. Control of resources is critical in any conflict.
Right, and this power plant would have been a massive strategic win. The second objective was about relieving pressure. Another front was seeing intense military activity, and this Kursk offensive was meant to force a reallocation of resources, ease the strain elsewhere, a classic diversion tactic.
Got it. And the third objective, you mentioned historical baggage earlier.
Yeah, the third objective was all about leveraging that historical context. By taking control of this particular territory, the goal was to exert psychological pressure on the opposing side. It was a play on memory and potential vulnerability.
So a triple-pronged strategy, each objective feeding into the other. But something went wrong. What was the turning point?
That's where technology enters the picture, the rise of advanced drone warfare. We're not talking about your average reconnaissance drones. These were long-range, heavy hitters, capable of taking out supply lines, and they were incredibly effective.
So basically, they cut off the supply chain, creating a logistical nightmare for the forces in Kursk.
Precisely. Ammunition provisions, reinforcements, everything they needed to sustain the offensive was disrupted, leaving them stranded and increasingly vulnerable.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier how quickly things shifted. What happened next?
The situation for the forces in Kursk deteriorated rapidly. They were trapped, encircled in what military analysts call a cauldron.
A cauldron. That sounds ominous.
It is. It really encapsulates their predicament. Completely surrounded enemy forces, closing in escape routes, vanishing, a truly desperate scenario.
So what about the opposing side? How did they manage to turn the tables so decisively?
Well, a combination of factors played into their success. First, they were remarkably adept at exploiting weaknesses. They even used a gas pipeline to infiltrate enemy lines and move nobody anticipated. This unconventional tactic caught the opposition completely off guard, highlighting the importance of adaptability in modern warfare.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the old rules don't always apply.
Exactly. Now, to understand just how dire the situation became, we need to bring in the perspective of Colonel Reisner, an Austrian military analyst known for his sharp insights. He's been following the situation closely, and his analysis is quite sobering.
What's he saying?
Colonel Reisner is very clear. What started as a seemingly brilliant offensive is now teetering on the brink of utter catastrophe. He's drawing parallels to historical examples like Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia situations where overextended supply lines and fierce resistance led to disastrous outcomes.
So he's saying history is repeating itself.
In a way, yes. Reisner argues that the loss of intelligence support has been a major factor in this downturn. Without accurate, up-to-date information, the forces in Kursk were effectively flying blind, unable to anticipate enemy movements or counter their strategies effectively.
So they're outmaneuvered, cut off, and lacking critical intel. What does Reisner think will happen next?
He paints a pretty bleak picture. He believes the opposing force now has the upper hand, dictating the terms of engagement and potentially preparing for a decisive blow. This shift in the balance of power has far-reaching implications for the entire region.
This is already sounding like a major turning point. Where do we go from here?
Welcome back. Picking up our deep dive right where we left off, a military situation in the Kursk region that has gone from a bold power play to, well, a potential quagmire.
And it's not just the immediate situation that's got everyone on edge, right?
Yeah.
We're talking potential ripple effects that could extend far beyond the battlefield.
Absolutely. Colonel Reisner, the military analyst we mentioned earlier, made a point of emphasizing the initial intent behind this offensive into Kursk. It was supposed to be a show of force, a way to gain leverage and potentially dictate terms in any future negotiations.
So the idea was to use this occupied territory as a bargaining chip to force concessions from the opposing side.
Precisely. Yeah. It was a high-stakes gamble, and as we've seen, it hasn't paid off. The loss of this territory isn't just a military setback, it's a blow to any hopes of negotiating from a position of strength.
It really makes you question the decision-making, doesn't it? To go all in on a strategy that was so vulnerable to disruption.
Hindsight is always 20/20, but yes, the potential consequences of this miscalculation are significant. And it's not just about the loss of territory, it's about the shift in power dynamics that's now unfolding.
It's like that old saying, you live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Yeah.
They tried to exert their dominance, and now they're facing the consequences.
It's a stark lesson in the unpredictable nature of conflict, especially in the modern era. The opposing side, to their credit, has shown remarkable adaptability and tactical awareness using unconventional methods to gain an edge.
Like that gas pipeline maneuver we talked about earlier. Using infrastructure to infiltrate enemy lines, that was a bold move.
It was brilliant, frankly. It completely disrupted the opponent's expectations, and it underscores a fundamental truth about modern warfare. It's as much about psychology and deception as it is about raw military might.
So where do we go from here? What are the possible outcomes? What's the best case scenario for the forces stuck in this cauldron?
At this point, the best case scenario is probably an organized retreat. But let's be honest, even that's a long shot.
Why is that? Couldn't they just pull back their troops and regroup?
It's not that simple. Remember, they're facing overwhelming odds, their supply lines are compromised, and their morale is likely plummeting. Plus, a chaotic retreat could turn into a rout making a bad situation infinitely worse.
So they're trapped between a rock and a hard place. What about the opposing side? What are their objectives at this point?
Well, if we're to believe Colonel Reisner's assessments, they're aiming for much more than just pushing back the offensive. He believes their long-term goal is to establish control over a significant portion of the territory, potentially redrawing the map in their favor.
And if they succeed, what would that mean for the region?
The implications are huge. We're talking about a potential domino effect, where neighboring countries feel the pressure to realign their allegiances. It could destabilize the entire region, creating a power vacuum that could be exploited by various factions.
Sounds like a recipe for chaos. And to make matters worse, we haven't even factored in the withdrawal of support from key allies.
That's right. The loss of intelligence sharing in particular is a crippling blow. It's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back. You're constantly reacting to the enemy's moves instead of anticipating them, which puts you at a massive disadvantage.
So not only are they facing a superior force on the ground, they're also lacking the intel needed to make informed strategic decisions.
Exactly. And that combination is what makes the situation so volatile. It has the potential to escalate quickly with consequences that could extend far beyond the immediate region.
It's a grim picture for sure. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, can you give us a quick recap of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Certainly. First and foremost, the situation in Kursk is far from over. What began as a bold offensive has become a desperate fight for survival. Secondly, we need to acknowledge the opposing side's strategic acumen and tactical flexibility. They've outmaneuvered their opponents at every turn.
And third, the withdrawal of support has left the forces in Kursk in an incredibly precarious position. It's hard to see a path to victory from where they stand now.
Precisely. And that brings us to the most critical question of all, what happens next?
Well, for that, we'll have to move on to the final part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring the potential long-term consequences of this conflict, examining the various scenarios that could unfold, and trying to make sense of what it all means for the future. Okay, we're back, and the tension is definitely building. We've spent the last 2 segments breaking down this military situation in Kursk, and it's not looking good.
Yeah, it's a complex situation for sure. And as we enter this final part of our analysis, the big question is, what are the long-term consequences of this debacle?
Because it is a debacle, right? There's no way to sugarcoat it.
I think that's fair. What started as a bold strategic move has become a desperate fight for survival, with potentially huge consequences for the region and beyond.
So let's talk about those consequences. What are the different scenarios that could happen from here?
The most immediate concern is the fate of the forces trapped in that cauldron. Can they get out, or are they facing surrender?
And what if they do manage to retreat? Does that mean they can just regroup? Or is the damage already done?
A retreat, even if they pull it off, would be a major blow. It would show weakness and embolden the other side and could trigger a whole chain of events that could reshape the entire power balance of the region.
You mentioned earlier that the opposing side might have even bigger ambitions. What did Colonel Reisner say about their long-term goals?
Reisner has been saying for a while that their objective might be complete control of a big chunk of territory, and this win in Kursk, if you can call it that, brings them one step closer to that goal.
And if they succeed, what would that look like?
Imagine a region where alliances are broken, where neighboring countries have to rethink their loyalties, and where the threat of conflict is everywhere. The geopolitical implications are massive.
It sounds like a nightmare. And it makes you wonder, why would anyone risk the stability of a whole region like this?
It's a question a lot of people are asking, and it shows a basic truth about international relations. Power vacuums are dangerous. When one side stumbles, others jump in to take advantage, and the consequences can be devastating.
And to make matters worse, we have this withdrawal of support from allies. Does that factor in?
Absolutely. The Hawker loss of intelligence sharing is a huge blow. It's like trying to walk through a minefield blindfolded. You're always in danger of making a mistake, a fatal mistake.
So not only are the forces on the ground facing a stronger enemy, they also don't have the information they need.
Exactly. And that's what makes this situation so dangerous. It could get out of control very quickly with effects that reach far beyond the region itself.
It's a reminder that even in the 21st century, the threat of conflict is real. And the choices made in the next few days and weeks could have a big impact on all of us.
This situation in Kursk is a small example of the challenges we face in a world that's more interconnected and volatile. It's a reminder that the old rules of war don't work anymore, and that the stakes are higher than ever.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the message for our listeners?
Pay attention. Stay informed. What's happening in Kursk isn't just some regional conflict. It's a sign of things to come. The world is watching, and the outcome matters to everyone.
It's a reminder that the future is uncertain, and the only way to deal with these times is to stay engaged, think critically about the information we get, and understand the forces at play.
The world is a chessboard, and the pieces are moving fast. If you don't understand the game, you'll be a pawn.
On that note, we'll leave you with some final thoughts. As this situation in Kursk develops, ask yourself, what does this tell us about power in the world today? What are the lessons here? And how can we use this knowledge to understand a world that's increasingly complex and unpredictable?
These aren't easy questions, but they're worth thinking about. The future is being shaped right now, and we all have a role to play in it.
That's it for our deep dive this week. We'll keep an eye on the situation in Kursk and bring you updates. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.